about some theoretical things. I'll kind of gloss over them just because a lot of the lesson content is somewhat unfinished. Maybe I'll finish it one day. But just some things to think about if you're interested. Okay, one is I'll just point you towards the delayed execution. So the idea here is that in traditional animation systems where we have eager execution, where we execute an animation as soon as created, that can lead to some problems with parallelism. So to solve this, what Monocurl has is it has a delayed execution environment where we don't actually execute animations until the end of a slide. So even if you actually do p plus equals set, at this point, set actually hasn't been called. So it hasn't actually been called. In some sense, it has been called because there's this weird thing about we have a runtime component and then we have a initialization component. So half of set's been called, but the actual animation hasn't been called until the very end. So at this stage, technically set hasn't been called. It's only been added to the playlist. Okay, so it's only been added to the playlist, and then once we reach the end, then we would execute all the animations in the playlist, reset, and move on. And why this is great is it allows us to do parallelness a bit better. It allows us to have abstraction and parallelness, which in eager execution you just fundamentally cannot have. Okay, so that's great. So Monocurl allows more abstraction and parallelness than eager execution, but in fact it doesn't actually allow everything. And I used to have it so that you could do pretty much everything. But the thing is that if you make a trade-off where you limit some behavior, you can have the syntax be a lot nicer. So a lot of the syntax of Monocurl becomes a lot nicer if we can get rid of those very weird edge cases that in practice you typically won't even see anyways. Excuse me. But the case that I'm talking about that Monocurl can't do is essentially when you have an animation that's near the end of the playlist affect animations at the beginning of the playlist. And you can see that's going to be somewhat problematic because, well, we can do that. We would do that by somehow doing a sticky animation, and then we can, if we get the offset just right, you can somehow make some animation far down in the playlist execute well before some animation near the beginning of the playlist, and therefore it'll affect that animation. And I mean, this is kind of like the grand paradox. It doesn't we don't really want to consider this behavior. It's not nice to think about. It's much cleaner if we say that an animation towards the beginning of the playlist can have an influence the animation in the future, but not the other way around. And this brings us to the idea of semi-sequential animations, where at an intuitive level, an animation is semi-sequential if it's allowed to have parallel animations, but we can't have it so that a parallel animation in the future affects a parallel animation in the past. So if you do get into a stage where you do want this behavior, more often than not, you can just solve it by flipping the problematic animation into the beginning, and that it expresses intent a lot better too. But in fact, even if you do that, even if you do allow reordering, there are still cases where you can have it so it's actually impossible for Monocurl to execute. But again, these are so theoretical that I don't think anyone would likely see them in practice. And if they do see them in practice, it probably means that they're doing something wrong anyways. So not super big deal.